Is Iran witnessing the moment when state control finally fractures? Or is this only the calm before a far harsher response? That question has echoed across the region as reports emerged that security forces were pushed out of multiple major Iranian cities, including the capital Tehran, in what analysts describe as the most serious internal challenge to the Islamic Republic in decades. If confirmed, the loss of operational control in the country's political and symbolic center would mark a turning point with consequences far beyond Iran's borders. What makes these developments especially striking is not only their scale, but their speed. Within days, footage and eyewitness accounts suggested that security forces were no longer fully present in Tehran, alongside other large urban centers, such as Isfahan and Shiraz. Roads were blocked, major highways seized, and neighborhoods effectively slipped beyond immediate state reach. For a system built on constant visibility and coercive presence, even temporary gaps carry enormous psychological weight. The perception of control once lost is notoriously difficult to restore. Could this sudden erosion of authority be sustained, or will it trigger a decisive counterstroke from the regime? That is the question many Iranians and foreign capitals are now asking. The leadership in Tehran appears to understand the gravity of the moment. According to multiple reports, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei placed the country's security apparatus on its highest alert level, surpassing even those seen during previous regional conflicts. This escalation reflects a fear that the unrest is no longer localized or episodic, but systemic. Unlike earlier protest waves, the current demonstrations appear to be geographically dispersed, socially diverse, and persistent, despite severe repression. Equally concerning for the regime are signs of hesitation within its own enforcement ranks. Videos circulating before the nationwide internet blackout showed police officers applauding protesters or stepping aside rather than intervening. In a system that relies on layered coercion, police, Basij, regular military, and the Revolutionary Guard, even limited cracks at the lower levels raise alarms at the top. History suggests that once enforcement becomes inconsistent, momentum can shift rapidly in favor of the streets. At the same time, the protests are unfolding against a backdrop of regional instability and global distraction. The war in Ukraine continues to reshape energy markets and strategic calculations, while NATO countries remain focused on deterring further escalation in Eastern Europe. Iran's leadership is acutely aware that prolonged internal chaos could weaken its regional posture at a time when its proxies and alliances are already under strain. Western analysts note that urban control is not merely a tactical issue, but a strategic one. Large cities are logistical hubs, media centers, and symbols of legitimacy. Losing them even briefly sends a signal to both domestic audiences and foreign observers that the state's grip is no longer absolute. This is particularly dangerous for a regime that defines itself as unchallengeable. Meanwhile, the human dimension of the unrest cannot be ignored. Despite threats, arrests, and lethal force, crowds have continued to grow. The willingness of demonstrators to return night after night suggests a depth of anger that exceeds economic grievances alone. Many appear driven by a broader rejection of political exclusion, social repression, and the absence of accountability. As events continue to unfold, the situation remains fluid and highly volatile. The regime still commands formidable resources, but the scale of the unrest has introduced uncertainty into calculations that once seemed predictable. Whether this moment marks the beginning of irreversible change or a prelude to intensified repression remains unclear. Yet, as Tehran's streets filled and authority visibly wavered, one thing became unmistakable: what followed next would test not only Iran's leadership, but the limits of state power itself. Why would a regime built on layered security suddenly place its most feared force at the very center of domestic repression? That question moved to the forefront as Iran's Supreme Leader shifted responsibility for the crackdown directly to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, a move widely interpreted by analysts as a sign of deep anxiety inside the state apparatus. The decision was not merely tactical. It reflected a growing fear that the regular instruments of control were no longer fully reliable. In Iran's internal security architecture, escalation follows a clear hierarchy. Police handle routine order. Paramilitary units step in when protests expand. The regular armed forces are held in reserve. The Revolutionary Guard, however, is the regime's final guarantor, ideological, heavily armed, and deeply invested in the survival of the system itself. Turning to the Guard signals that the leadership perceives an existential threat rather than a manageable disturbance. What unsettled Tehran most were early indications of wavering loyalty among ordinary police and conscripts. Footage circulating before the communications blackout showed officers applauding demonstrators, exchanging gestures of solidarity, or simply withdrawing from confrontation. In tightly knit urban neighborhoods, enforcing lethal orders against familiar faces carries a psychological cost that authoritarian systems often underestimate. History shows that regimes rarely fall because of protesters alone. They fall when enforcers hesitate. This hesitation explains why the Supreme Leader bypassed conventional chains of command. The Guard is structured differently from other forces. Its members are vetted, ideologically rewarded economically, and embedded across political and commercial sectors. Loyalty to the system rather than the state defines its identity. From the leadership's perspective, the Guard is less likely to fracture under pressure, but its deployment comes with severe risks. One of those risks is escalation beyond control. Revolutionary Guard units are trained for asymmetric warfare and external confrontation, not crowd management. Their presence on city streets raises the likelihood of lethal force being used early and decisively. Analysts warn that once such violence begins, it narrows the regime's options. Compromise becomes impossible, and retreat appears as weakness. At the same time, this shift exposes another vulnerability: capacity. Even the Guard cannot be everywhere at once. Protests have erupted simultaneously across multiple provinces, stretching response units thin and forcing rapid redeployments. Reports of highways blocked and access routes disrupted suggest that demonstrators are learning, adapting, and exploiting the state's logistical limits. Urban geography, once an advantage for surveillance, is becoming a constraint. Western security experts also note the political message sent by sidelining regular forces. It signals distrust, not only internally, but publicly. When citizens see elite units replacing local police, it reinforces the perception that the government is ruling through fear rather than consent. Such optics can fuel further resistance, especially among undecided segments of the population. Meanwhile, the decision has regional implications. Iran's Revolutionary Guard plays a central role in projecting power abroad through allied militias and strategic partnerships. Redeploying attention inward risks weakening external deterrence at a moment when Iran faces pressure on multiple fronts. For NATO planners and U.S. policymakers, this internal diversion is being watched closely as a potential inflection point in Tehran's strategic posture. Yet the leadership appears willing to accept these costs. From its perspective, survival at home takes precedence over influence abroad. The calculus is stark: restore control now, or risk a chain reaction of defections and defiance that could spiral beyond containment. As armored vehicles and elite units replaced familiar uniforms on city streets, the message was unmistakable. The regime was preparing for a fight without compromise. Meanwhile, what followed next would reveal just how far it was willing to go to hold power. How far can violence escalate before it reshapes the conflict itself, rather than suppressing it? That question has become unavoidable as reports of deaths, mass injuries, and overwhelmed hospitals began to dominate the narrative of Iran's unrest. What started as a struggle over control of streets and symbols has rapidly evolved into a humanitarian and psychological crisis, one that now defines the confrontation between the state and its citizens. Accounts emerging before and during the nationwide communications blackout describe a sharp rise in the use of live ammunition against demonstrators. Medical workers speaking anonymously to international media reported waves of critically injured patients arriving within hours, many suffering from gunshot wounds. Several hospitals in Tehran and surrounding cities were said to be operating beyond capacity, with shortages of surgeons and emergency staff compounding the strain. In authoritarian systems, hospitals often become silent witnesses to political turning points, and Iran's medical infrastructure is now under that kind of pressure. What makes this phase especially destabilizing is not just the number of casualties, but the profile of those affected. Doctors and aid workers describe many of the injured and deceased as young students workers and first-time protesters. Such losses carry a disproportionate emotional impact, amplifying anger across families and communities. In societies with strong kinship ties, every death reverberates far beyond the individual, multiplying resistance rather than extinguishing it. Can fear still function as an effective deterrent when grief turns into resolve? That is the dilemma confronting the authorities. Historically, the Islamic Republic has relied on decisive violence to break protest movements, as seen in earlier uprisings. Yet analysts note a crucial difference this time: information, even when restricted, is leaking out faster than before. Medical staff, relatives, and witnesses continue to document events, preserving evidence that challenges official narratives and sustains public outrage. The strain on hospitals also exposes an operational weakness. Emergency services are designed to handle accidents and natural disasters, not sustained internal conflict. When facilities are overwhelmed, mortality rises not only from violence, but from delayed treatment. This dynamic risks creating a feedback loop where the visible collapse of basic services further undermines state legitimacy. Western observers emphasize that such conditions often mark a shift from protest to resistance. When demonstrators believe they face lethal force regardless of restraint, the calculus changes. The movement becomes less about demands and more about survival and dignity. At that stage, repression may reduce numbers temporarily, but it hardens those who remain. The violence is also being closely monitored abroad. For NATO countries and the United States, scenes of escalating casualties raise difficult policy questions. Public opinion in Western capitals tends to react strongly to images of civilian suffering, particularly when young people are involved. While direct intervention remains unlikely, sustained bloodshed increases diplomatic pressure, sanctions risk, and Iran's international isolation at a moment when its economy is already under strain. At the same time, Iran's leadership appears determined to prevent hospitals themselves from becoming centers of dissent. Reports of security personnel monitoring medical facilities and removing bodies have circulated widely. Whether fully accurate or not, such claims deepen mistrust and reinforce the perception of a state willing to conceal the human cost of its actions. Yet despite fear, exhaustion, and loss, demonstrations have not stopped. In some cities, they have grown. This persistence suggests that violence, rather than restoring order, may be accelerating a broader rupture between society and the ruling system. As hospitals filled and casualty numbers climbed, one reality became clear: the conflict had entered a phase where every additional night carried irreversible consequences. Yet as the streets grew quieter under force, another battle was quietly intensifying: the fight over information itself. What happens when a government loses control of the narrative, but still controls the switch? That question came sharply into focus as Iran imposed a near-total nationwide internet shutdown, severing millions from the outside world in what analysts describe as an attempt to regain informational dominance after losing physical control in parts of the country. In modern unrest, visibility is power, and Tehran's leadership appears determined to fight this battle as aggressively as it has fought on the streets. The blackout unfolded in stages. First came severe throttling, then the collapse of mobile data, and finally the near-total loss of connectivity. Telephone networks followed. Officially, authorities framed the move as a security necessity. Unofficially, it was widely interpreted as an effort to prevent images of violence and mass resistance from shaping global opinion. In previous protest cycles, such measures bought the regime time. This time, the outcome has been far less certain. Why? Because the information environment has changed. Despite the shutdown footage continued to surface from Tehran and other major cities, suggesting that alternative communication channels remained active. The most significant of these has been satellite-based connectivity, particularly Starlink terminals, reportedly smuggled into the country over recent years. These devices, originally designed for remote access, have taken on an unexpected political role by allowing pockets of connectivity to survive even under state-imposed isolation. Western technology analysts estimate that tens of thousands of terminals may now be active inside Iran, shared across neighborhoods and protest groups. Even limited access is enough to transmit short videos, images, and messages fragments that collectively undermine the blackout's purpose. From the regime's perspective, this represents a profound loss of control. Information no longer flows through a single choke point. Could Tehran neutralize this threat? Reports suggest that authorities attempted to do exactly that. Network monitoring groups observed unprecedented levels of signal interference targeting satellite uplinks during the early hours of the blackout. Specialists described patterns consistent with advanced jamming technology capabilities that Iran is not widely believed to possess at scale on its own. This has fueled speculation that external assistance, potentially from Russia or China, may be involved, a development that would carry significant geopolitical implications. Such cooperation would mark a convergence of authoritarian interests in countering decentralized communications. Moscow has gained extensive experience in electronic warfare during the Ukraine conflict, where satellite connectivity has played a critical role in sustaining Ukrainian command and control. Beijing, meanwhile, has invested heavily in information control technologies. For Western governments and NATO planners, signs of this kind of technical collaboration raise concerns about the future of open communication in crisis zones worldwide. Yet even as jamming efforts intensified, they appeared only partially effective. Disrupting satellite networks on a national scale is technically complex and resource-intensive. Interference can be localized, inconsistent, and temporary. In practice, this means the blackout slowed information flow, but did not stop it, a critical distinction. Each clip that escapes reinforces the sense that the regime is fighting both protesters and the truth. The psychological impact is equally important. For demonstrators, knowing that the outside world can still see fragments of their struggle sustains morale. For authorities, the inability to fully silence that signal adds pressure to act quickly and decisively, potentially accelerating harsher measures. As Iran's streets fell into digital darkness, the conflict shifted into a new dimension, one where satellites, signals, and servers mattered as much as soldiers. Yet even as the regime fought to control information, new symbols and faces began to emerge, hinting at questions of leadership and what might come after. When a system begins to crack, symbols often speak before leaders do, and in Iran's streets, those symbols are changing fast. Images emerging despite the blackout show demonstrators waving the lion and sun flag, a pre-1979 emblem that predates the Islamic Republic and carries a powerful emotional charge. In parallel, photographs of Reza Pahlavi, the son of Iran's last Shah, have appeared sporadically among crowds. Together, these images point to a deeper question, now confronting the protest movement: if the old order is rejected, what or who comes next? The appearance of these symbols does not necessarily signal a unified political program. Iran is a country of more than 90 million people spanning generations, ideologies, and memories. For many protesters, the lion flag represents something broader than monarchy, a reclaiming of national identity from clerical rule. It is less about restoring the past than about rejecting the present. Western analysts caution against over-interpreting any single symbol, noting that revolutions often gather disparate meanings under shared banners before clarity emerges. Still, leadership vacuums rarely remain empty for long. Reza Pahlavi's name has resurfaced, not because of organizational dominance on the ground, but because of recognition abroad and the absence of alternative national figures. From exile, he has positioned himself as a transitional voice, rather than a claimant, to power, publicly endorsing a democratic process and distancing himself from authoritarian rule. That message resonates with some, but skepticism remains widespread inside Iran, where memories of the Shah's repression have not faded. Does symbolic visibility translate into real influence that remains uncertain? Analysts note that successful transitions typically require three elements: legitimacy, organization, and internal coordination. At present, the protest movement shows immense legitimacy and courage, but limited centralized structure. This decentralization has made it harder for the regime to decapitate the movement, yet it also complicates negotiations, messaging, and future governance scenarios. Meanwhile, the regime itself appears acutely aware of this symbolic battlefield. State media has intensified warnings against foreign-backed alternatives, framing any emerging figure as a tool of Western interference. This narrative is aimed not only at hardline supporters, but at undecided citizens who fear chaos more than repression. By portraying all alternatives as illegitimate, the leadership seeks to present itself as the only barrier between order and collapse. From a strategic Western perspective, this uncertainty is critical. NATO governments and the United States have learned from past transitions that backing personalities too early can backfire, delegitimizing organic movements and reinforcing regime propaganda. As a result, official statements have remained cautious, emphasizing human rights and restraint rather than endorsing specific leaders. Yet symbolism continues to matter. Flags, chants, and images create emotional cohesion in the absence of formal leadership. They allow disparate groups, students, workers, professionals, to recognize one another as part of a shared moment. That cohesion sustains momentum even when repression intensifies. As debates over leadership and identity quietly unfold, the movement stands at a crossroads. Symbols alone cannot govern, but they can prepare societies for change by reshaping what people believe is possible. Meanwhile, as Iran's internal questions grow louder, attention is shifting outward toward Washington, its allies, and the warnings now coming from the White House about what may happen next. Could external pressure tip the balance, or would it harden the regime's resolve at the most dangerous moment? That question has come to dominate strategic discussions as the United States under President Donald Trump responded to the rapidly unfolding events in Iran with unusually direct language. While Washington has stopped short of intervention, its warnings have added a new layer of uncertainty to an already volatile situation. In public remarks, President Trump signaled that the administration was closely monitoring developments and drew a clear red line around mass killings of civilians. The message was calibrated, but unmistakable. The United States would not remain indifferent, if violence reached levels seen in previous crackdowns. At the same time, officials emphasized that involvement would not mean ground forces, but rather measures designed to inflict pressure where it hurts most, a phrase widely interpreted as economic cyber or precision responses. How credible is that deterrent? Western analysts are divided. On one hand, Iran's leadership is acutely sensitive to U.S. leverage, particularly in areas tied to energy exports, financial access, and strategic infrastructure. On the other, external threats have historically allowed Tehran to rally nationalist sentiment and justify harsher internal repression. This creates a paradox: pressure intended to protect civilians may, if misjudged, accelerate violence rather than restrain it. The international context complicates matters further. The ongoing war in Ukraine has already pushed global energy markets into a fragile equilibrium. Any instability in Iran, a key regional player with significant energy reserves, carries ripple effects for Europe and beyond. NATO governments must therefore weigh moral imperatives against economic and strategic risks, especially as they remain deeply engaged in supporting Ukraine against Russian aggression. That conflict also shapes perceptions inside Iran. State media has attempted to link the protests to Western interference, drawing parallels to color revolutions and foreign-backed unrest. Yet this narrative appears increasingly strained as demonstrations continue, despite the absence of direct external involvement. For many Iranians, the struggle is framed not as geopolitics, but as a reckoning with decades of governance. Still, history offers sobering lessons. Iran has seen major protest movements before in 2009, 2019, and 2022, all of which were eventually crushed through overwhelming force. Each time the cost was measured in lives, arrests, and long-term trauma. Today's uprising is larger and more persistent, but it faces the same fundamental asymmetry. The state retains heavy weapons, while protesters remain largely unarmed. This raises the most difficult question of all: what happens if the movement fails? Analysts warn that a failed uprising could be followed by an even harsher campaign of retaliation, targeting not only demonstrators but anyone suspected of sympathy. Mass arrests, executions, and purges would likely follow, deepening Iran's isolation and hardening its political system for years to come. And yet, uncertainty cuts both ways. The scale of current unrest suggests that repression alone may no longer guarantee stability. Each act of violence risks widening the rupture between society and state, making long-term governance increasingly costly and brittle. As the world watches and waits, the outcome remains unwritten. Iran stands at a crossroads where every decision by protesters, by leaders, by foreign powers carries consequences that may shape the region for a generation. What happens next will not only define Iran's future, but test how far power can stretch before it finally breaks.